Hello, and welcome to the Let's Talk Transformation podcasts. In this episode, we will be talking about leadership and the power of storytelling and acknowledgement. I'm delighted to welcome Kylee Stone, founder of the Performance Code, leadership expert, LinkedIn Top 20 voice, and also the host of the Uncharted Leaders podcast. Kylee, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Susie.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. Your mission is a quest we both share, which is to disrupt the status quo on, I'd like to say, traditional views of leadership and to help people discover their potential and lead their lives differently, which for me comes down to connection, human connection. And in this world, technology enables us to connect more than ever. This is a prime example. We're clearly not in the same country, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee human connection, does it? So I would love it if you could start with telling us your story and why you set up the Performance Code, and also why the Uncharted Leaders podcast.
Yeah, I think I'll go straight back to the moment where I think that the turning point for me was around my own personal journey with leadership. And, you know, it was the moment where for the first time in my life, I was challenged with this question of not knowing how to just stuck. How do I get beyond this current challenge? And the challenge was I was in a senior leadership position at the time. It was 2010, so it's 12 years ago. And yeah, God, it flies. And so I was the marketing and strategy director at News Corp at the time, and I had just had my third child. So 2007, I had my first child. A year later, fell pregnant again, had my second child. And on both occasions, Susie, I had a remarkable return to work. I loved my job. I loved my team. I had, I would be lying if I said the actual having children was the easy part, was the hard part.
But that's a lot of change, isn't it? That's a lot of change in a very short space of time.
It was. And I think, my return to work with my first child was very, very straightforward. I went back to work actually after a few months. He was a great sleeper. So after a few months, I found myself really ready to kind of balance part-time with going back to work. And then the same thing happened with my daughter, my second child. I went back a bit later, but so I really had 2 rounds of maternity leave over in that space of 2 years, which is a pretty tight time frame.
Yeah, absolutely.
But at that time, I was very well supported back in my job. I had a great team. I actually got one of the biggest pay rises and one of the best promotions I've had in my career whilst I'd been on maternity leave. So I really, for my own personal experience at that time, was really remarkable.
And that support is so important though, isn't it, Kylee? When you go back.
Absolutely. I mean, I had a great team, and there was a number of different factors that I'd say all had that work. And then in 2010, I fell pregnant with my third child, my son, and I went back into I remember walking back into the office, wanting to go back to work part-time. I think for the most part, I was pretty desperate to just go somewhere and have a hot cup of coffee and, have a decent conversation instead of dealing with 3 kids under 3.5, But I remember walking back into the office and to have a conversation with my boss about negotiating my arrangement, and I really wanted to go back into my job on a part-time basis, because I'd spent it was probably 5 years all up working on this big project to get across the line a major rebrand in the company. And when I'd left just before my last child, I'd actually developed the implementation plan. So it was kind of on its way in implementation. Right. So when I came back in, I really wanted to get back into that project. And but my boss wanted me full-time in that role. And I really could not see. I was like, I can't see how to make this work. I feared not only my own well-being, but the well-being of my family. And I also didn't want to look back on my life and have regrets. I just thought, God, if I look back and think, was it all worth it to really sacrifice these early days with my kids? And I didn't want to do that. So we did split my role. I took all the strategy kind of back office stuff, but then my My operational role was taken by a person who was doing my maternity leave. And that was all great because I could do that part-time. But the only problem was within a matter of maybe 3 to 6 months, it was roughly between that time, I was bored.
Yeah.
I was like, hold on, I have not spent 20 years of my career to work hard to get to this point, to get into the sitting in the executive team, building the business, creating growth, running a team, being accountable, all of those things. Suddenly all those parts of the job, which comes with leadership, were no longer there.
Because you were part-time, or because your job scope had changed, or?
No, because I was part-time and he wanted someone in the job full-time.
Okay.
And back in those days, there was no such thing as flex work for anyone in a senior position. So I thought to myself, I remember sitting outside the office where the boardroom was actually one day, and everyone else was walking the meeting, and I just felt like this, there's an episode, part in Dirty Dancing, where baby Houseman's sitting in the corner, and yeah. And I had one of those moments. I just thought, this is not what I envisioned for myself as a leader. And so I went on a pathway after that. And it's right, that's it. I need to do something about this. And so I did what I traditionally do, which I've since learned some valuable lessons. But even despite having the 3 kids, I went back to university. I was like, I'm going to have to arm myself with the next level of credentials, right? I'll go back and I'll do an MBA. That'll help me with able to get the next level up, right? I did that. I got myself a coach. I signed up with this. I decided I was going to take on transformation and change as my next gig. So I signed up for this.
This is a small project.
That's right. Yep. That's right. And I signed up for I became a member of the Change Management Institute, got myself a mentor. And I reckon I must have had about 6 or 7 books on my bedside table on everything from, Google search inside yourself, how to rework your life, what's the great work of your life, what's your life purpose, Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In. I mean, you name it. I was really throwing myself into everything I possibly could to try to work out how do I fulfill on this thing called fulfilling my passion for wanting to be a contribution, build businesses as a leader, but not be stripped of it just because I was in part-time. So that was the moment that it all happened for me. And of course, I ended up going on a discovery where, in fact, one of the books that made a big difference was there's a book by Robin Sharma called How to Lead Without a Title. And it was a very similar story to my own where, here I was, I'd gone down this traditional path of what looked like how you get to be a leader. You work hard, you get a promotion, you work longer, you work harder, you get a little pay rise, you work, until eventually you get
climb
to that position.
a vertical ladder. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. But, the only problem with that, obviously, is in a hierarchy, you've got lots of roles at the bottom and very few at the top.
Yeah.
So even when you do get to that point, you're not always guaranteed if it happens. I mean, I happen to be blessed because I did get that position, but all of a sudden then it disappeared. And I was like, well, how do I now get to express myself given that that only happens in that team? So that was literally what happened. And what I did discover was actually my experience of being a contribution, my experience of all the things that I loved to do as a leader, around building great brands, around, leading a team, and didn't come from that position. I started mentoring a group of other women, ironically, while I was going through this journey, because I bumped into a woman who was in a similar position at the coffee shop, and she'd asked me how I was, and I think she was shocked because I turned around and I said, I'm awful. She said, oh, what do you mean? What do you mean? And I said, well, I'm damned if I'm really disappointed that, suddenly it seems like just because I can't do full time, that my brain cells don't work and I cannot have a leadership position, and she said it was the same for her. So she just asked me what I was doing, and I told her, and she says, oh, wow, that sounds really great. And I said, look, I'm happy to share what I've been doing. And that turned into multiple conversations, and ended up with 55 women in this mentoring group.
But I think these things never happen by accident, though, do they? That's my belief.
Well, no. No, that's right.
Mm.
And ironically, you know, the storytelling thing, that's what opened that pathway, because what I realized out of that journey, and I've been in the business of storytelling for 20 years.
Mm.
But it was always about the business of that and the communication and, you know, those things. But what I discovered in that mentoring was that there was a transformation occurring when I was willing to tell my own story to other women, and in their hearing my own story, they were really engaged in the opportunity for themselves. And so then they came on board, and, you know, we had these circles and these, you know, get-togethers, and honestly, it wasn't about educating any of us anymore. I mean, we're a bunch of very successful, you know, women who'd been in 20-year career. It wasn't about coming in and teaching us something that we needed to know about leadership. What all we were doing was just telling stories. And out of the telling stories, some of us had probably the biggest breakthroughs or experiences of growth and success that we'd had in our experience of being a leader than we'd ever had in our own roles as leaders. So it just changed really the direction for me in that moment. And I thought, wow, you know, and just from that point, Susie, honestly, it was just organic. You know, we were like, wow, this is, you know, we should host an event. And then we hosted an event, and we brought in storytellers. And at the end of the event, you know, we had a sellout. We had, I think it was 160 odd people at this event, and everyone just loved it. And they were like, oh, you've got to do more of this. And so we did more of it. And that's kind of how it evolved. And next minute, I'm like, wow, this is, you know, who needs a damn title to express oneself as a leader?
Absolutely.
Like, so, you know.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So that's kind of what got me on the journey. And of course, what I realized in that process was that there was no set direction. There wasn't like there was an end in sight, or there was a role, or there was a task where I got to work on something. That journey in and of itself really was nothing other than really pursuing what I deemed to be very important to me, what I was passionate about. Off my vision, you know, I just stated this vision for myself about how I wanted to have an impact. I did some work around my core values. What are my strengths? In fact, what do I really want to do, and how does that look? And then it became more about what I took out of my life than it did about what I put into my life. And by taking out all of these things that were no longer consistent with what I really wanted, I just found myself naturally making more of a difference.
And I'm hearing three things, like purpose, individual purpose, and your values, but also the storytelling on top of that. So how does that trilogy, if you like, purpose, values, and storytelling, how has it helped you build your business? And how do you use it to help others build their businesses?
Well, firstly, it came through my coaching of others, because it was really what I was doing for myself to fulfill on the results that I wanted became of interest to those around me. And I got I remember the very first one. I had a woman who reached out to me who used to work in the media industry and in marketing, and because my background's in marketing. And you know, she was looking for a coach. She was actually looking for what's the next thing. She was thwarted in the role she was in, wanted to kind of look at what else was available for her. She just went looking for a coach and saw that my background was similar to her. But when she reached out to me, it was surprising, because at that stage I didn't quite know where I was positioning myself. I was like, you know, but what appealed to her is she saw that I was a coach. She saw that I was a marketing director. So I got experience in being in leadership. And she also then saw that I was started up this not-for-profit, because we did then register what we were doing with mentoring groups for women as a not-for-profit. We went, let's just register it. Let's see what we can do with this. We'll keep doing what we're doing. And because of those three things, what that meant for her was she came to me because she saw me as a woman who was able to pursue what was important to her when it came to a leader and expressing myself and my confidence. And she's like, but at the end of the day, she was just looking for the same. You know, she was here wanting to accelerate and grow as a leader, and saw what I did was a demonstration of what she was looking for. And that was as simple as what it was, Susie. And so that happened. And then it really was word of mouth. She got extraordinary results out of literally 3 conversations that we'd had, which was challenging us on the traditional way in which we look at the way that we go about, you know, our career, and instead take a look at what inherently is the thing that you truly want, you know, regardless of where you think you need to go. Because a lot of women will come to me and say, this is the job I want. I want to get the next level of a promotion. And I go, okay, I understand that. I was like, and what is it about that that's of interest to you? Oh, well, I think it's just the next thing. I want to express myself as a leader. And so then ask them actually what's really important. And when you ask them what's really important, it's not the title. It's never the title. And it's never that. It's just the opportunity to make a real difference. So the two things I work on then is I say, okay, well, let's actually just reconnect with what's actually really important. And how you do that is you do the work on your own values, because the process to get clarity on your values requires you to take a good look at your life. It takes you to look back at your past. What are the things that have gotten you to where you are? What the journey that you've taken is never an accident. If you assume that it's not an accident, what are all the things that have caused the highs in your life? And equally, what are all the things that you fight for? Because the things that we fight for, or the things that we fight against sometimes, they are the things that will give us the indicators of what our core values are. And this blows me away. And I did not know this until I did it, but it wasn't until I started doing this with women that I actually discovered, for the most part, there's a big complaint, especially in the corporate world, that companies don't align with my values. But then when you go to ask them, well, what are your core values? They're actually not clear.
No, and I think they just stay in that sort of, I call that gray space, where they don't feel completely in sync with themselves, hence the work mask and the home mask. And I don't think in corporate, well, it's slightly changing, but in corporate cultures today, we don't encourage people to ask themselves what their values are.
No, it's always the work on the company values, and rightly so. And I went through this myself, right? I valued, what I realized I valued was courage. I didn't quite know that was the way to articulate it at the time, but I did, and it was only through conversations with others that became really clear for me. But then where I could see it didn't align was I'd be in meetings and I wasn't courageous. I didn't speak up. I did not say things in meetings where I was holding back. I was sitting there doing exactly the same thing, complaining about how other people were not being responsible for the way that they were interacting with each other, but I wasn't saying anything. I was like, oh my God, no wonder why there's a disconnect there for me. Like I'm not expressing my core value of being courageous because I'm not in there saying things or not stepping up, because I felt like that I was afraid that if I did, that I would be ostracized or I would be the next to go. And there was too much at risk in losing my job that I wouldn't do that.
And I just wonder how many people stay in that place of fear for almost all their career, because, it's a box, isn't it? It's sort of a very rigid ladder. And what you're essentially doing is encouraging women to step out of the status quo if they don't feel that fits with their value base.
Yeah. And the turning point was realizing that whilst I was busy complaining about what was happening in the company, about what was not there, what I had failed to realize was actually that was just because I didn't have access myself for how to fulfill on the things that were truly important to me in a way that didn't undo my commitment. Just thwarted by fear and not knowing that fear was actually present.
And so acknowledging that there was fear there. I mean, I think I wanted to come to the subject of acknowledgement because you talk about it a lot, and I would love you to give us your take on acknowledgement and which lever it is and how powerful it can be.
Yeah, well, that was probably a very good example, right? Because acknowledgement, firstly, for me is, it's the first step for me in a series of practices to dismantle the lack of freedom, let's say, or the constraint that we have to express ourselves naturally. And why it's been so powerful is because when we actually do the looking for ourselves and we acknowledge what's going on, like it's a bit like, I think if I was to dumb it down for myself, which is what I often do to make it easier, is say to myself, well, what's really going on, Kylee? Really, if you really tell the truth to yourself, what's going on? Like you go to work, you show up, and in those days for me, what was going on is I'd show up pretending I was happy to do this job and thwarted and, all good, all good. And yet I was pissed. I was complaining. I was, all a whole world of stuff, right? So in that moment for me, the shift came immediately after just stepping back and telling the truth to myself. It wasn't necessarily that I needed to go tell the truth to the world. All that mattered was I needed to tell the truth to myself. And when and the truth to myself was, at that time, I was like, oh God, you're the one complaining and not saying anything. Oh, how okay. So what is there that you can do for yourself? Because nothing's going to change out there. It's only your reaction to what's out there that's going to shift anything. So therefore, if all the power exists over here for you to do something, acknowledgement gives me the ability to say, okay, I have everything I need in my own sphere of control, to be able to impact and do and say what there is to do. Now, I might make the decision to do something. I might make the decision not to do something. Whether I do or not is not the point. But what there is recognizing that I'm the one making that decision to look from what do I want and need in order to express myself fully. So the most important part for me about acknowledgement is really the simplicity of telling the truth to ourselves about what's really going on.
Yeah, because I think we don't often, do we? I mean, you can go for your whole life without really telling yourself the truth, because you just create a narrative, an internal story that carries on and carries on. And I think when you say leadership is an inside job, this is a prime example of, purpose is an inside job, values is an inside job, acknowledging both is an inside job. What do you see the leaders that you deal with struggle with the most in this challenge?
How do I make the difference I want to make? And in fact, this was one of the reasons why I decided to do the podcast, because I've been on both sides of the fence, right? I've been an employee for 20 years, and then I got into a leadership role for 6 years. So I knew what it was like when I looked back and started to look at my own challenges as a leader, right? And I was like, oh God, yes. As an employee, I was one of those people who would complain about the leadership of the organization. It was the leadership's fault for why something wasn't happening in the business, right? So whenever something doesn't work as an employee, all the blame goes to the leadership team, right? Then on the flip side, when you're in a leadership position, your only desire, because you've been an employee, when you get to that point, all you want to do is help everybody else in the business, fundamentally. Now, I'm not saying everyone's good at that, right? People have got their problems and they show up in a good way and they show up in a bad way. No doubt about that, right? But fundamentally, when we get into that role, it's not that we have an intention to show up in each day and go, you know what, I want to actually rock up and treat someone like an asshole. I actually want to go and destroy someone's life. We don't do that, right? No. So the thing that I noticed was that as a leader, for me, when I was in leadership, oh my goodness, when things do go well, however, so on the flip side, when they go great, guess who gets all the acknowledgement? Or who wants the acknowledgement? Now, this is not a generalistic, stereotype view of things, but as a leader, when in a business, when things go well, you want to acknowledge the team, and the team will be like, where's my, reward and recognition, and rightly so. But what's happening all the meanwhile is here you are as a leader. When things go bad, it's all your fault. And when things go great, it's got nothing to do with you. Yeah, that's really great. I'm really thrilled about being in that job. Right? And I saw that and I just went, wow, that's really debilitating, really debilitating. And every single leader I have spoken to, every single one, inevitably, every conversation is like, I just am struggling to try to make the difference I want to make. That's it. And what I realized was, hold on, it's not your job to make someone else happy.
Yeah.
I got your commitment and I can see where you're looking from, but it's not going to shift anything if you see it that it's your job to give other people the answer. We are and this is the thing about communication that I think is really important. We are really good at talking, really good. We give our opinions, we give our advice, we point out what we think is missing, but what's missing often is listening. Just actually listening to our staff or listening to what they want so that the employees do the discovery for themselves and they can release and express their own potential. That is not happening. I mean, we're living in a time where no one has time for anything.
Nope.
I mean, I don't know about you, but I certainly know in my time in leadership, I think I might have had one performance meeting with my boss, like one. He's like, you're good, aren't you? I go, yeah. Right. I was always had to work it out for myself. There was never any sit down conversation. How you going? What's working? What's not working? In my own experience as a leader, right? It was always just meetings around metrics of the business, what we're doing, what we're not doing in the business, like that. It was never about that kind of stuff. No, personal development. And in my era as a leader, there was always, oh, it's the soft conversations are hard. Are you kidding me? Yeah. It's like, you know. But I think now one of the things that I'm a big advocate of is as a leader, I think the best reference point is coaching as a coach, because a coach's job is never to give anybody answers. You know, a coach's job is only to listen and to listen for the greatness and give some guidance and feedback about what they hear. And I think as a leader, fundamentally, if we're going to empower others, it's not about giving instruction or managing on a task and all of that thing. It's actually about stepping back and allowing other people to really come forward with the discovery and the communication of what they're up against, but making them feel safe so they can come and tell you what they're dealing with.
I think it is letting go of the control, isn't it? Because, I mean, you know, I call that creating a space. So if they create an environment where those conversations can happen and that dialogue can happen, I was very lucky. I had those dialogues with my bosses, but it didn't on personal development and how I'm doing and how I'm not doing. But it didn't stop me just wanting to be busy all the time, because for me, that was the code of what was valued in the organization: delivering. So being busy was being a good leader. And I think it was myself who got myself stuck in that wheel. But of course, the system perpetuates that because that's how the system works. So I think even if you have those discussions, it's still, we're back to the inside job discussion, Kylie. It's still up to the person, me in this case, to step back and have a look at, is that really fulfilling what I want to do? And is it giving me enough time to create the space you've just spoken about for the rest of my team? And I think that was always difficult, and it was something I never spoke about, and it wasn't particularly spoken about.
Oh, and it's still not. It's still something that's not. In fact, when we're in a company, we're always trying to make sure we know what we're doing. And then if there are times that even when we don't know, we have to make sure we look like we know, because there's too much at risk. Yeah. Well, what occurs is my job's at risk if I do not know, and I pretend that, you know, and I don't have the answer, because I am measured on that, right? And that comes back to my other point about acknowledgement. And this is the other side of the coin, is that there is a general, well, I'd say a lot of noise about the lack of acknowledgement as a gift of gratitude in a business. Very little, and we'd probably call this version the version of appreciation. Yeah, people feel very underappreciated. And so when I look back, and in fact, yet again, this will be a very common pattern, not only from, you know, I had this for myself back in the day, and I would complain about the same thing, but in every person I've spoken with over the last 10 years who's in leadership, or there is this, I'm not appreciated. I'm not appreciated for what I do. There's no acknowledgement. There's no thanks. There's none of that, right? So the fallout of that, of course, is a hidden level of resentment that sits underneath the surface. And what we know about resentment is that even if for the most part, it's blind to the human eye, you know, it's not one of those, if we look at the iceberg in terms of the conditional thought, in that level of thought, it doesn't exist there. It sits underneath the surface, not present, but we're walking around pretending that we're not resentful when inevitably we're very resentful, the fact that we don't feel appreciated. And what happens when we do that is we pull back. We don't give as much effort. We pretend we're putting in effort when the reality is we're not really fulfilling our potential. And the biggest person who suffers is us.
Yeah, we're just internalizing the suffering and the resentment and pretending that we're okay because we need to carry on delivering and doing.
That's right. And whilst I say that's the biggest impact, it's the biggest impact from my point of view at the level of humanity, right? Because as a human being, that's very debilitating. And that's what I think inevitably is the most important thing here. But at the same time, if we look at results in organizations, you know, for years, the figures around organizations will only deliver 70% on strategy. Change plans, most plans fail. The statistics on those have not changed for years. No. And there's no surprise, you know, I think, but organizations have almost become conditioned to that. It's like, well, this is just the way that it goes. Well, if you're happy with the status quo.
Yeah. And I just think I like that you refer to acknowledgement as a practice, because it is about changing habits, isn't it? Because I don't, you know, often we throw solutions at it like, oh, teach people how to give feedback, teach them how to communicate better, do a bit of positive appreciation, which is great, but it's an ongoing practice, isn't it, in terms of changing a habit and therefore changing the environment.
Absolutely. And it is a job that needs to start with us. And I think this was the thing that I noticed that was challenging even in my journey of practicing it, is there's an underlying expectation that somebody else should give it to me. So acknowledgement should come from someone else, like my boss should acknowledge me, or someone else should say thank you for it. So there's all these shouldisms that we carry, expecting somebody else to do it. But where we actually get power is realizing that if we see that we're missing acknowledgement, it is up to us to get that. No one else is going to know that that's what's missing for us. Like, it's not suddenly someone's going to have this visible insight into our internal state, knowing that that's what's going on. So that where I got power for it with myself to start with was realizing that and it actually, bizarrely enough, it actually started for me at home. You know, I've got the 3 kids, as I said to you, and I really noticed just how much I felt unappreciated because, you know, I was doing so much and it was just assumed that it was part of the thing. And that's no different to work. No. You know, it is your job. And so why should I step out? And I mean, that's just what's expected, right? But then I was like, oh, what if I turned around and said, thanks, Mum. Thanks for doing that. I really appreciate it. And it felt very weird to start with. But what I realized at the end of that was that I did not need them to say anything, actually. I just needed it to be acknowledged. And I realized that I could make the request for that. I could ask for what I need. And the part that I also discovered is there's sometimes it's a specific person we want it from. You know, there's certain people around us with whom we really want it, because if somebody comes and gives us all this acknowledgement, oh yeah, but you're so great, but then we still don't feel like it's any different, because it's usually there's one person in particular, or there's some people in particular that you specifically want it from, and unless you get it from them, it's still there.
So we're back to the questioning of purpose and values, the same deep questioning of who do I need acknowledgement from, why, and when.
That's right.
And do you use that as a basis for working with the small businesses you help? And do you see a difference between men and women on that?
So yes, it's a practice with everybody. In fact, I introduce it in many different ways. Like, for example, every single call I have with a client, I ask them I start with acknowledgement and I end with acknowledgement. So the starting in the conversation with acknowledgement is what is there that's going on that you'd like to talk about? So they bring into existence everything that they're dealing with. Now, if they come to the call and they've just had a fight with their partner, or they've had this happen, or they're this flustered by something else, I want to know about that. You know, you don't need to pretend that nothing's going on in your life, because what happens in our life and how we deal with that stuff is what actually gives us power. So I start every conversation always with that. And then I always end every conversation with, what do you want to acknowledge? What do you want to be acknowledged for? Or what is it that was of most value out of the conversation that you would like to be acknowledged, that you would like to acknowledge, because then it gives them a space to put attention to something. So I introduce like simple things like that, and then I invite them to do practices of it. And it depends on where certain people are at. If you've got people that really undervaluing themselves, in the neuroscience work that I do, there is a practice about we call it 3 good things. At the end of every day, write down 3 good things that you did. That's a source of acknowledgement for yourself. So you start to really get, actually, when I'm acknowledging myself, I actually don't have as much need for it out there in the world. You know, so it's definitely that. There was another question I think you asked me about. Do you see a
difference between men and women on this particular point?
Yes. Do I? No, I do not.
Interesting.
No.
Interesting, because it's always portrayed.
Across both.
Yeah, it's always portrayed that women need it more. And seeing as we're in the business of breaking stereotypes and looking at the status quo, I just wanted to get your opinion on what you're seeing and how it fits back into what we hear around women's need for acknowledgement and men's need for acknowledgement, Kylee, particularly in the workplace.
Yeah, I'm, well, obviously not being a man, I don't know, but in terms of coaching, from a coaching perspective, it's never shown up any different. It's missing on both parts, because often what happens when we show up to work, as you'd know, women are more likely to be expressive, so it's more visible. So it's something that we see a lot more. But the men that I'm working with, they are also pissed. They're like, the expectation that I'm just going to keep, and they'll just keep working hard, and they become very, high achievers, and they operate in this mode of success and driven and all the rest of it. But I promise you, some in fact, some extraordinary, high performing, successful leaders. And this distinction in itself has made an extraordinary difference. And it was usually for men, what happens is it shows up in the unseen.
Yeah. And so I think that's another conversation we have to change. It's a little bit like the mental health conversation, boys don't cry discussion, because I think humans are humans, and everybody has those basic psychological, emotional and needs,
Absolutely. So you are spot on when you say it looks like women feel like they need it more. Absolutely, it looks that way. But when we come into a space where we've got that psychological safety and a desire to really communicate what's going on, inevitably both of those, that practice works very profoundly for both.
And what I love about those type of practices is it comes to break your own bias, the unconscious bias that we all have, because everyone has bias. But I think, if you can actually start by looking at your own bias, so what triggers me, what am I thinking, what type of bias am I showing up with, then only then can you start looking at practices for yourself. To come back to one of your first points around it's an inside job. And once you've done the inside job, you can start looking at helping the outside. So
exactly. And I think if we put it back into a simple context around leadership, that great leaders are people that other people want to follow. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And whether their view about themselves is that they're good or not, at the end of the day, it actually doesn't matter. All that matters is you're showing up as somebody with whom other people want to be around and want to follow. And that doesn't mean also that they've got to follow like behind you, but they just want to be on the journey with you. They just want to work. They want to be around you. They want to do what you're doing. They want to be up to stuff with you. And so that inside job for me is that's what the Uncharted leader is all about. It's like at the end of the day, are you showing up for yourself in the best way possible? Because when you put your head on the pillow at night, whether or not you've done a good job. We really do. Yeah, and it's about being able to sleep at night, isn't it? Sleep at night in inverted commas, being in tune with your values. Absolutely. Time is running. I do have a last question for you, though, around what would your final call to action be, therefore, to leaders who are looking to find out why they feel this disconnect between what's happening in the workplace and who they really are? Well, my favorite call to action on this one is the place where I often find all of us need to go back and start is self-compassion. It is tough. It is, and unfortunately, we did not need a pandemic to tell us things are difficult. Actually, things were already difficult before the pandemic. And if anything, actually, I think all the good things that have come of the COVID and that kind of stuff was needed, much needed, because we've certainly had to step back and look at new ways of working, which we're now doing. But compassion, because if I just look at the statistics and the way that things happen, mental health statistics are massive. The trauma, we are in a generation where we're at the effect, like we're the children of the generation that were in the war. I'm a descendant of the stolen generation. So my lineage is, my grandmother was taken away from her family when she was only 3. The impact of that trauma is intergenerational. And so what happens with our generation, certainly my generation, is that we're leading from a trauma response. And that trauma response can show up as being very critical on oneself, but we forget that we're being critical on oneself. And what ends up happening is we actually play it harder in the world. We play harder on ourselves. We play harder on everybody else. We lift up these expectations and we keep running, and it's just exhausting. It's just a massive source of burnout. And so the call out for me is no matter what you're dealing with, no matter what you're doing, I mean, things might look really great for you right now, but anything can change in any given moment. And even if things are going great for me, it's not great for me if the people around me are suffering. It's not great for me if my community is suffering. I mean, as an Indigenous person, it's never great for me unless the entire community is thriving. And we are a long way off that happening. So if we're going to see any shift, we cannot be sitting here going, well, it's up to someone else to do something about that. Actually, what difference am I really going to make in what I do in my own closed door at home? You know what? Actually, it's a big impact, actually, because every thing that we do for ourselves impacts and ripples out in the world. So self-compassion and really just doing the work on yourself so that you know that you are authentically showing up in a way that allows you to authentically connect with other human beings, because at the end of the day, that is all that's important. We as human beings are wired for connection.
Yeah.
And if we're not coming back and looking at what's missing for me, even if other people around us are, they could behave as bad as they want, right? And we have the ability to interrupt that. We have the ability to do something about that. We could put our arms around these people and go, I'm sorry, you're having a bad time. But we do not do that. So massive call out, self-compassion. And my guru on self-compassion is Kristen Neff. She runs the Compassionate Institute.
Yeah.
And if you don't, do the reading on it, do the videos on her. It's remarkable.
Okay, super. Thank you. I'm going to leave our listeners with that 2 calls to action for me. 1, self-compassion, and 2, more compassionate leadership, which is a completely different paradigm from the one we have today. Kylee, thank you so much for sharing your story and your insights and your experience with us. Where can people find out more about you and what you do?
Susie, I think the easiest part is LinkedIn.
Okay.
We all know that it's easy to go there, and you can find there, and people can message me and connect from there.
Okay, excellent. So go and connect with Kylee on LinkedIn.
Thanks, Susie.
Thank you. We hope you enjoyed this episode. And if so, please go to iTunes and give us your feedback and your review. And if not, I'll see you soon for the next episode of Let's Talk Transformation.